morning I've ever spent in my life.
Sure. You write affectionately about your mother, about very few other women, and
Mrs. Thatcher.
And indeed affectionately there too. But
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, well, as I've already... Azar Nafizi, author, a great friend of mine, author of the unbelievably brilliant, beautiful book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, which if you haven't read, you should. He was a tremendous defender of the rights of the downtrodden and raped and dispossessed women of Iran. But no, I'm sorry to say this girl in the Happy Isles knocking shop was a real, woof, boy. Even now, I can think of it. But it was the greatest, that outing with Martin to the handjob parlor was the best example I can think of turning lead into gold, because it was fantastically sordid and nasty and depressing expedition he made me come on. Field work, he said, for his novel, Likely Story, where this girl tried to keep on bidding me up all the time. Every time I agreed to a price, she'd raise it. As I say in my report of it, the price was the only thing in the room that showed any sign of enlarging itself. But when I would later read the relevant chapter of Martin's novel Money, I realized it was all fine. That these girls didn't know it, these avaricious minxes, but they were in the service of literature that day. And they've written an imperishable page.
All right, we'll go back to them, shall we? Let's give it one more go. We're going to try microphone number 3.
Can I just...
Ironically, we could hear that for the first time. But,
and I just wanted to know how that support started and whether or not...
It was the question's in relation to Iraq.
How did your support for the war in Iraq begin? And do you now consider the war that you've supported a success?
Okay. A theme of my book, which I had thought at one point of calling Both Sides Now, is the operations of the dialectic and the way I could, as it operates in society and internationally and in the economy and so on, and also in my own cortex. So the one reason why I supported intervention in Iraq was because of my long history of opposition to it. I've been going to Iraq since the mid-1970s, since just before the time, in fact, when Saddam Hussein managed to get all power in his own hands. And I'd seen the steady evolution of the country into a one-man show run by a psychopathic crime family, as I've already said, with aggressive designs on its neighbors, committing genocide within its own borders, using weapons of mass destruction both inside and outside its borders, and borrowing from the worst of both fascism and Stalinism in its ideology. And I realized that the anti-war position, the position of containment of this regime, was based on a false premise, which was that this psycho leader understood self-preservation and understood deterrence and containment and sanctions and so forth. That's absolutely not true. Whenever he can, he makes the most insane possible decision. And this is very terrifying. It's not unlike the dealings we're currently having with both North Korea and Iran. You cannot be certain, indeed you have every reason to doubt, that unlike as with, say, the Soviet communists, that these people have any concept of rational self-interest. They may even indeed be suicidal. So there's no possibility of relaxation while they're around. You can't sleep, and there's no possibility of coexistence. Ultimately, I believe our civilization's existence is incompatible with neurotic expansionists, latently and blatantly aggressive, xenophobic and theocratic regimes. So, and I give a whole chapter to showing exactly how my mind changed. It's not about what I think, it's about how I think, which I hope is more interesting. And if you buy it, I'll sign it. And as for now, well, in 2003, Saddam Hussein organized a referendum in his own favor. in which for the first time in Iraq, and I think in the first time in recorded history, a turnout of 100% was claimed, as well as a recorded vote for the only candidate claimed. Never been done before, with people forced to jump up and down, ululating and cutting their wrists to write their ballot papers in blood and shouting for jihad and martyrdom and self-sacrifice. Unbelievably horrifying business, presided over by the dictator and his two sons, the voluptuously sadistic and deranged Uday and Qusay, whose succession was the thing we'd be living through now if we'd allowed the chance to occur. Now, the president of Iraq is Jalal Talabani, who I met when he was the leader of a gassed and murdered and dispersed Kurdish people, the guerrilla socialist leader in the mountains in 1991, the first ever elected president of Iraq. His party is the corresponding party of the Socialist International. His people, the Kurds, have an autonomous zone protected and self-governing in the northeastern provinces of the country. There's a written constitution, there's a parliament, there's a court of appeal, a free press, regular elections. I know a lot of people think that it would have been better if we'd left Saddam Hussein alone, but I can't be of that party. I'm terribly sorry. I think this is an improvement.
For your answer.
You make the case passionately for the invasion of Iraq. What
intervention?
Intervention in Iraq. Liberation, sure. What do you not think that it should follow that America should intervene in all situations where the values of liberal democracies are being undermined, or what's the tipping point for you?
Well, first, the United States and its coalition allies are in Iraq still under a United Nations mandate to reconstruct the country. So it's not a unilateral intervention, and in my opinion, there was no need for a second resolution for the intervention after the Security Council had voted 9-0 to say that Saddam Hussein must either come into compliance or face grave consequences, and the certainty is he never came into compliance. Iraq is now in compliance with the resolutions on weapons of mass destruction and has been inspected and now can be said to be free of them, but it couldn't have been said to be that before unless you're willing to take on trust Saddam's regime itself, which I wouldn't recommend. I don't think after its record it was entitled to the smallest scintilla of the presumption of innocence. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, what do you have to do if you're a state to sacrifice your sovereignty? How far do you have to go? Well, there are 4 possible conditions. One is you invade and occupy the territory of neighboring countries. The second is if you violate the Genocide Convention, which mandates, by the way, if it's broken, it mandates action by all its signatory powers. If you can't, either to prevent or if you can't prevent, to punish the genocide. The third is fooling around with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and trying to acquire illegal or use illegal weapons of mass destruction. And the fourth is giving aid and comfort to international terrorist organizations as designated. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, multiply guilty on all 4 fronts several times. And its sovereignty gone. It was under a UN-imposed sanctions regime. Most of its airspace was patrolled by foreign aircraft to protect its people from a renewal of genocide. It was a matter of how long it could stay half slave and half free. I think that question was resolved the right way. Now, I don't know of any other regime that qualifies to have lost its sovereignty in quite that way. Robert Mugabe did send some mad troops into the crazy war in the Congo, but you can't say he invaded or occupied a neighboring country. He doesn't have any weapons of mass destruction. He doesn't give sanction and cover to international terrorist groups. And even though his policy of food denial to areas of the country that don't support him is certainly criminal, I don't know if it would quite raise to the level of the Genocide Convention.
And would you make the same argument about North Korea?
North Korea is openly in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Not that it's ever signed it, but I mean, in the principles of same. It's starvation of its people to a point where they're 6 inches shorter than South Koreans. That's a lot of starving and stunting people down to that extent. It is a terrifying commitment to keeping your people hungry And it's a good question as to whether you can commit genocide against your own